Start Hour 23, page 718. Claims vs. the facts. Supporters of EXIM make many claims about the benefits that our nation and citizens derive from having an export credit agency. These claims, however, are not supported by the facts. The bank is an example of government-granted privilege. Traditionally, one of EXIM's top 10 domestic beneficiaries is Boeing, which at a 40% share of total loan authorizations dwarfs the 25% share for all small businesses that received EXIM services combined. On the foreign side, things are not much different. The subsidized financing largely benefits very large companies like Mexico's Pemex, Ireland's Ryanair, and Emirates Airlines that either collect massive subsidies as state-controlled entities or could easily access private financing. American businesses that lack political connections are put at a competitive disadvantage by their own government because they are forced to compete against both domestic and foreign businesses that enjoy access to subsidized loans. The bank does not maintain or create jobs. EXIM supporters point to the numbers of new jobs that they claim have been created through federal spending, but the unseen effects are ignored. For example, funding for one industry or firm might take more jobs away from other industries and firms, resulting in a net job loss even though jobs are created for the financed firm. At best, it could be said that the bank redistributes employment from unsubsidized firms to subsidized firms. However, with very rare exceptions, most exports financed by EXIM would have taken place without government support. Many companies have said so themselves. The procurement happens before the decision to get government support, and, as noted above, most EXIM deals go to large companies with easy access to capital. Thus, the agency is taking credit for jobs that would have existed in any event. The bank does not promote exports. EXIM presidents commonly claim that the agency's mission is to support U.S. jobs by facilitating American exports through its export financing tools. However, trade economists have long known that export credit subsidies merely redistribute exporting opportunities to subsidized firms instead of increasing the net number of exports, something that also slows economic growth. Even more telling is the performance of the U.S. economy and American exports during the 4 years when EXIM lacked a board quorum, 2015 to 2019, and was barred from finalizing deals in excess of $10 million. During that time, EXIM authorizations fell from $21 billion in FY 2014 to $3.6 billion in FY 2018, adjusted for inflation. However, also during that time, regular big-ticket EXIM beneficiaries continued to benefit from their easy access to capital markets and still had the ability to finance their export activities. Further, U.S. exports were utterly unaffected by the reductions in the bank's activities. U.S. unemployment fell to a level not seen in half a century, but exports soared with financing provided by commercial lenders. The only negative economic impact from EXIM's lack of a board quorum was its effect on the bank itself. This contradicts EXIM's claim that its activities are crucial for the success of U.S. exporters and economic growth. Instead, it shows that economic growth is the best booster of U.S. exports and job creation and that it does not depend on EXIM subsidies. Subsidy-boosted exports do not boost economic growth. EXIM's primary reason for existing is to increase exports, as if more exports themselves represent more jobs and economic growth. Recent expressions of this fallacious belief can be found in a book by former EXIM president Fred Hochberg. According to Hochberg, we know that trade, and exports in particular, can have a big impact on jobs. While this is a common misconception about exports, it is one worth correcting. As trade economists know, exports are a cost to the economy, they subtract from GDP. Imports, on the other hand, add to GDP. If the US could acquire all of the imports that it currently gets without exporting anything in exchange, that would be the best of all worlds. Unfortunately, one reason that foreigners are so eager to sell us their goods is that they want our dollars to buy our debt, invest in the country, and buy our exports. That is why exports drop when overall imports drop. Exports promote U.S. economic growth only if the value of the resources used to produce them is less than the value of what we receive as imports in exchange for those exports. By subsidizing American exports, EXIM causes too many resources to be devoted to producing exports. As a result, the total value of our exports is made larger than it would otherwise be to obtain any given amount of imports. In other words, EXIM thus compels American taxpayers to subsidize foreigners' standards of living at no appreciable benefit to the U.S. Unfortunately, this misunderstanding and the constant glamorization of exports and their impact on jobs and growth are used to justify government support for some exports. On average, 98% of exports are not backed by EXIM financing. It also is extremely unfair. Because capital will tend to shift from unsubsidized companies to subsidized companies, taxpayers foot the bill if companies backed by the bank default. Unsubsidized export companies face higher borrowing costs, which could translate into fewer jobs in unsubsidized companies or lower pay for their workers. The bank does not promote growth by leveling the playing field. EXIM's charter stipulates that one of its missions is to support U.S. exports with the goal of creating jobs and promoting economic growth through the provision of export financing via its loan guarantee and insurance programs. In particular, EXIM is to intervene in cases where such support is necessary to level the competitive playing field for U.S. exporters due to financing provided by foreign governments to their exporters. As a result, EXIM for years has been focused primarily on what other countries' ECAs are doing and how much financing they are providing. A reading of any of EXIM's competitiveness reports shows that the bank frames the competitiveness of the U.S. economy and exporters in extremely narrow terms, specifically as the amount of business that foreign ECAs are doing relative to EXIM. The report for 2020 features striking evidence of this mindset. For instance, lamenting the nearly 4-year hiatus during which the bank lacked a board quorum to approve large deals, EXIM's leadership maintains that these years severely hindered EXIM's ability to support the competitiveness of U.S. exporters. During that time, foreign ECAs fundamentally evolved their philosophy and substantively expanded their roles, and the United States must work hard to keep pace. The bank goes on to promise that it will re-emerge from the years of being out of the long-term export finance business and restore its standing as one of the world's most competitive ECAs. In other words, EXIM bureaucrats appear to believe that economic growth and jobs result not from a favorable tax and regulatory environment, but from a victory in hand-to-hand subsidy combat between government banks. The bank's competitiveness reports include a table that ranks countries by ECA financing volume. An adjacent map displays the most competitive ECAs around the world, implying that the U.S., which ranked 8th in terms of volume in 2019, the year before the pandemic, is losing ground compared to more hyperactive, ranked higher, ECAs. The implication is that ECA export financing improves the overall health of the export market and thereby fuels economic and job growth, which it does not do. Consider Italy's hyperactive ECA. In 2019, Italy was ranked first among Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, countries in terms of volume and was highlighted in the report as an example for other countries to follow. Yet the Italian ECA's hyperactivity appears to have had little impact on that country's economic growth or employment. Germany was the second highest ranked OECD country on this list in 2019. While Germany had respectable economic growth at the time of the report, only 0.7% of its exports were backed by ECA financing. These data provide little support for the argument that Germany's strong economic performance has much, if anything, to do with the German ECA. China by all accounts had a hyperactive ECA, it ranked first on the list in 2019. ECA-backed exports in China represented 2.1% of exports backed by government financing. Whatever one perceives as China's economic successes, it is hard to argue that the main driver of China's exports is its ECA. The report highlights the 8th-ranked U.S. for its unusually low level of EXIM-backed exports. At the time of the report, the U.S. economy was thriving, wages and employment were up, and the country still had flourishing trade, but it was also striving when EXIM was mostly dormant. In other words, one cannot argue that the bustling economy was the result of EXIM support. Even in countries touted as leaders in relying on ECA financing, ECA-backed exports are never more than 4.7% of total exports. Moreover, even that is an outlier. For 23 of the 28 countries on this list, including both China and the US, the share of exports backed by ECA financing is less than 2%. This fact suggests that contrary to the claims of EXIM's advocates, ECA financing is irrelevant to the overall health of the export market as well as to economic growth. This is consistent with what economists know about the impact of subsidies on economic growth. The bank does not support small businesses. Most of the bank's funding goes to large corporations such as Boeing, a recipient of 68% of EXIM's loan guarantees and 30% of EXIM's overall activities. Over the years, 10 large domestic corporations have received roughly 65% of the bank's total assistance. It is closer to 70% today. More than 99.9% of U.S. small businesses receive no benefits from EXIM and are often placed at a competitive disadvantage by the subsidies doled out to larger competitors. In fact, the bank's support for small businesses has declined from $2.3 billion in FY 200 and 1923 to more than $2.0 billion in FY 200 and 2024 to only $1.6 billion in FY 2021. This decline occurred amid a pandemic that hit small businesses especially hard, and it continues today. The bank is not a good deal for taxpayers. The bank's accounting practices are deficient, and the bank miscalculates its budget savings. While it claims that its operations will save taxpayers $14 billion over the next decade, the Congressional Budget Office has found that EXIM programs will actually cost taxpayers $2 billion. Numerous audits done by the bank's internal inspector general also show that the bank's risk analyses, default assumptions, internal reporting procedures, and financial reporting practices are not reliable enough to ensure the safe stewardship of taxpayer funds and responsible management of EXIM's vast portfolio. Failing to meet the China challenge. These days, to get whatever expansion of government one wants or to justify a new government activity, one has only to declare that more government intervention is needed to help fight China. President Trump used this argument to secure reauthorization of EXIM in 2019. Today, President Biden argues that the bank could be a powerful weapon in the government's geo-economic arsenal against China. The rationale is that this will prevent China from dominating the global market with its subsidies and will boost American jobs and manufacturing. The problem is that cynics who support such policies make no effort to adopt a serious strategic plan to achieve this goal. For instance, how can EXIM help us to fight China while state-owned Chinese companies like China Air have been some of the companies most subsidized by EXIM? 28 Furthermore, it has now been 4 years since Congress instructed EXIM to focus on China, but there has been no fundamental change in the way EXIM operates or the companies to which it extends taxpayer-backed financing. Deals related to the aircraft industry still dominate the bank's portfolio. In addition, there is no evidence that EXIM has altered its intense focus on competing with other governments' ECAs. If the bank were serious about competing against China, it would be targeting the low-income markets where China has been making its most important investments. Instead, its obsession with other ECAs has caused EXIM to direct the vast majority of its funding to large foreign companies in higher-income nations. Data available on the OECD website show that the level of ECA financing in high-income countries in 2019 was more than double the amount in low-income countries. The same was true for previous years. In other words, EXIM and the ECAs of the OECD are competing in markets where commercial lending is abundant, a trend that continues today. The failure to deliver on its congressionally imposed obligation, however misguided that obligation may be, is also noticeable in the fact that EXIM's China and Transformation Exports Program, CTEP, extended only $141.3 million in financing in FY 2022, a fraction of the $27 billion it is supposed to deliver by the end of 2026. The bank's efforts have also included a misplaced focus on emerging technologies such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence, which do not need EXIM financing because their foreign sales attract commercial financing without government support. The lack of demand for EXIM products could also be reflected in the bank's authorization of $5.2 billion in loan guarantees and support in FY 2022, down from its FY 2012 peak of over $35.70 billion during the Obama administration. This lack of activity also extends to the semiconductor industry, which has been picked as a focal point for a government-wide industrial policy effort to counter China's ambition to dominate that industry. Ironically, at the same time that some want to become more like China to fight China, China's leaders are realizing that their heavy-handed semiconductor subsidies are weakening the Chinese economy. According to Bloomberg News, top Chinese officials are discussing ways to move away from costly subsidies that have so far borne little fruit and encouraged both graft and American sanctions, people familiar with the matter said. While some continue to push for incentives of as much as $1 trillion US $145 billion, other policymakers have lost their taste for an investment-led approach that's not yielded the results anticipated, the people said. This development is not surprising to those who understand basic economics. The goal of using EXIM as a weapon against China was a bad idea in the first place. Even if it were a good idea, for it to succeed would have required that EXIM stop serving the clients it has been serving for decades. That has not happened, and it will not happen. Conclusion. The Export-Import Bank should be abolished because it wastes taxpayer money, adversely affects American businesses, and does not promote economic growth effectively. Furthermore, any attempts to reorient the agency and make it a weapon with which to fight against China are going to fail. Economic fights and national security fights are not won with subsidies. The case for the Export-Import Bank. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill extending the charter of the Export-Import Bank, EXIM, by an additional 6 years. In a signing statement attached to the bill, the president declared that he sends an important signal to both our exporting community and foreign suppliers that American exporters will continue to be able to compete vigorously for business throughout the world. As a candidate for president, Ronald Reagan was opposed to EXIM, but as president, he learned the challenges America's businesses face when competing for opportunities overseas, and his position on EXIM evolved. As President Reagan once famously remarked, "Why would I want our businesses competing with two hands tied behind their backs?" On January 30, 1984, the president said, "Exports create and sustain jobs for millions of American workers and contribute to the growth and strength of the United States economy. The Export-Import Bank contributes in a significant way to our nation's export sales." President Reagan was exactly right. EXIM provides a mechanism that American companies can use to vie for projects that would otherwise be out of reach, notably deals that the banking industry won't finance because of the risk associated with the host country or because the host nation itself requires a sovereign guarantee in order to submit a bid. EXIM is the only American vehicle that can provide that sovereign guarantee. Since Reagan's presidency, the global economic order has shifted dramatically, and a rising China has completely disrupted the export credit sector. In Reagan's era, export credit financing was a means for nations to compete for and win projects overseas in order to create more jobs at home. It was a benign tool for economic expansion. China, however, has morphed export credit financing into a weapon of national security. Where most nations have just one export credit agency, ECA, China has three, all targeted for specific stages of economic and industrial development. The amount of money China has put behind these three instruments is staggering. It is estimated that in 2018, China provided more than $500 billion in export credit, approaching in that 1 year the total amount of financing EXIM has provided in its 90-year history. China's export credit activity is greater than that of the ECAs of the entire G7 combined. Today, China is the world's largest official creditor, maintaining a portfolio more than twice the size of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund combined. China's highly aggressive Belt and Road Initiative, which has prompted international criticism for ensnaring the developing world in debt-trap diplomacy, has created a sphere of economic and strategic influence that includes about 150 countries, rivaling the relationships of the United States and her allies. Unlike America and the G7 economies, China does not subscribe to the rules-based order that has governed export credit financing for nearly a century. As in so many other things, China plays by its own rules and is opaque in how it operates, weaponizing its export credit financing deals by offering developing nations terms that are often too good to be true. Once the project is underway, the Chinese have been known to change the terms, making a project unaffordable for the purchasing country. These tactics have yielded China important strategic plunder like mines and critical minerals, satellites, and even ports like those in Hambantota, Sri Lanka, and Mombasa, Kenya. Export credit is a strategic weapon in China's whole-of-government approach to enhance its global power, economic might, and national security. The only country that has the economic heft to counter China's aggressions in export credit financing is the United States. Not only do American companies risk losing out to Chinese competitors for international opportunities if EXIM is not there to offer support, but a United States without a functioning export credit agency also leaves an unchecked China with a wide open field to claim jurisdiction over swaths of ocean and shipping lanes, expand its economic influence, and create major changes in the global balance of power. In response to Chinese aggression in export credit, the ECAs of other countries have reacted defensively to change their policies and programs to avoid losing access to large chunks of global markets. Many countries, including strong U.S. allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and Italy, have changed the mission of their ECAs from one of leveling the playing field for their exporters to hunting proactively for transactions for their businesses and advancing their national strategic interests over the long term. In addition, foreign buyers, particularly those looking to build large international projects, have been indicating that the availability of government-backed financing is a core component of their evaluation of bids and identification of sourcing. Allied nations have taken steps like lowering their content requirements in order to lure more deals, often at U.S. expense. Meanwhile, U.S. content requirements have remained constant, and the United States continues to abide by Traditional Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, rules. For example, the United Kingdom offered Boeing financing backed by Britain's ECA if Boeing would put Rolls-Royce engines on its jets instead of GE engines. Italy's ECA offered General Electric export credit financing in exchange for moving the production of some of its turbine components from the United States to Italy. China's tactics, as well as those of some of America's allies, have been successful in drawing manufacturing and the jobs associated with that production away from U.S. soil. EXIM's 2018 competitiveness report accurately documents how extensively foreign ECAs have expanded programs aimed at embedding their small and medium-sized exporters into the global supply chain to the detriment of U.S. exporters, particularly small businesses. To ignore these changes and leave the United States without its own export financing weapon is to resign the United States to a reduced role in world geopolitical affairs and accept fewer jobs and lower standards of living for many Americans. Critics of EXIM employ a host of defamatory slurs like crony capitalism and Bank of Boeing. The Bank of Boeing moniker is particularly misleading, as it was born in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis when the airline industry was particularly hard hit and private sector financing was not available for many airlines looking to purchase Boeing aircraft. EXIM's portfolio tends to be cyclical with different industries relying on export credit financing at different points in time, depending on economic conditions. The truth is that EXIM provides financing only when the private sector will not or cannot, a concept known as additionality. In addition, when EXIM does provide financing, usually in the form of a loan or loan guarantee, the borrower pays interest rates that are driven by the market. EXIM does not undercut the private sector. It does not solicit any applications for financing, and all applications are judged on the merits of the transactions. All transactions must have reasonable assurance of repayment, which is why EXIM has an exceptionally low default rate, historically hovering around 0.5%, a default rate that is the envy of private banking. When EXIM enters a deal, the American taxpayer is always protected first. If a deal goes into default, the U.S. taxpayer is paid back before any other lender. Borrowers are loath to default on the United States of America. This ability to manage risk successfully is why EXIM actually makes a profit for American taxpayers, described in government parlance as negative subsidy, sending more than $9 billion to the U.S. Treasury for debt reduction since 1992. The bank has also supported hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs, most of them in manufacturing, during the past decade. Export credit financing has become a critical lever for macroeconomic growth for many countries, allies, and competitors of the U.S. alike. Other nations are using ECAs strategically to influence decisions and procure economic opportunities, hindering the participation of U.S. firms and costing American jobs, particularly in manufacturing. China's aggressive actions in export finance bleed beyond economic advancement and are clearly an effort to expand both its national security and its global power. The United States would be foolish to abandon this field of play, surrendering it to China and other nations, and to relinquish EXIM as a powerful tool in America's asymmetrical warfare toolbox. Chapter 24, page 731. Federal Reserve. Money is the essential unit of measure for the voluntary exchanges that constitute the market economy. Stable money allows people to work freely, helps businesses grow, facilitates investment, supports saving for retirement, and ultimately provides for economic growth. The federal government has long made policy regarding the nation's money on behalf of the people through their elected representatives in Congress. Over time, however, Congress has delegated that responsibility first to the Department of the Treasury and now to the quasi-public Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve was created by Congress in 1913 when most Americans lived in rural areas and the largest industry was agriculture. The impetus was a series of financial crises caused both by irresponsible banks and other financial institutions that overextended credit and by poor regulations. The architects of the Federal Reserve believed that a quasi-public clearinghouse acting as lender of last resort would reduce financial instability and end severe recessions. However, the Great Depression of the 1930s was needlessly prolonged in part because of the Federal Reserve's inept management of the money supply. More recessions followed in the post-World War II years. In the decades since the Federal Reserve was created, there has been a downturn roughly every 5 years. This monetary dysfunction is related in part to the impossibility of fine-tuning the money supply in real time, as well as to the moral hazard inherent in a political system that has demonstrated a history of bailing out private firms when they engage in excess speculation. Public control of money creation through the Federal Reserve System has another major problem: government can abuse this authority for its own advantage by printing money to finance its operations. This necessitated the original Federal Reserve's decentralization and political independence. Not long after the central bank's creation, however, monetary decision-making power was transferred away from regional member banks and consolidated in the Board of Governors. The Federal Reserve's independence is presumably supported by its mandate to maintain stable prices. Yet central bank independence is challenged in two additional ways. First, like any other public institution, the Federal Reserve responds to the potential for political oversight when faced with challenges. Consequently, its independence in conducting monetary policy is more assured when the economy is experiencing sustained growth and when there is low unemployment and price stability, but less so in a crisis. Additionally, political pressure has led the Federal Reserve to use its power to regulate banks as a way to promote politically favorable initiatives, including those aligned with environmental, social, and governance (ESG) objectives. Even formal grants of power by Congress have not markedly improved Federal Reserve actions. Congress gave the Federal Reserve greater regulatory authority over banks after the stock market crash of 1929. During the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve was given the power to set reserve requirements on banks and to regulate loans for the purchase of securities. During the stagflation of the 1970s, Congress expanded the Federal Reserve's mandate to include maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. In the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's banking and financial regulatory authorities were broadened even further. The Great Recession also led to innovations by the central bank, such as additional large-scale asset purchases. Together, these expansions have created significant risks associated with too-big-to-fail financial institutions and have facilitated government debt creation. Collectively, such developments have eroded the Federal Reserve's economic neutrality. In essence, because of its vastly expanded discretionary powers with respect to monetary and regulatory policy, the Fed lacks both operational effectiveness and political independence. To protect the Federal Reserve's independence and to improve monetary policy outcomes, Congress should limit its mandate to the sole objective of stable money. This chapter provides a number of options aimed at achieving these goals along with the costs and benefits of each policy recommendation. These recommended reforms are divided into two parts: broad institutional changes and changes involving the Federal Reserve's management of the money supply. Broad recommendations. Eliminate the dual mandate. The Federal Reserve was originally created to furnish an elastic currency and rediscount commercial paper so that the supply of credit could increase along with the demand for money and bank credit. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve's mission was amended to maintain macroeconomic stability following the abandonment of the gold standard. This included making the Federal Reserve responsible for maintaining full employment, stable prices, and long-term interest rates. Supporters of this more expansive mandate claim that monetary policy is needed to help the economy avoid or escape recessions. Hence, even if there is a built-in bias toward inflation, that bias is worth it to avoid the pain of economic stagnation. This accommodationist view is wrong. In fact, that same easy money causes the clustering of failures that can lead to a recession. In other words, the dual mandate may inadvertently contribute to recessions rather than fixing them. A far less harmful alternative is to focus the Federal Reserve on protecting the dollar and restraining inflation. This can mitigate economic turmoil, perhaps in conjunction with government spending. Fiscal policy can be more effective if it is timely, targeted, and temporary. An example from the COVID-19 pandemic is the Paycheck Protection Program, which sustained businesses far more effectively than near-zero interest rates, which mainly aided asset markets and housing prices. It is also worth noting that the problem of the dual mandate may worsen with new pressure on the Federal Reserve to include environmental or redistributionist equity goals in its policy making, which will likely enable additional federal spending. Limit the Federal Reserve's lender of last resort function. To protect banks that overlend during easy money episodes, the Federal Reserve was assigned a lender of last resort, LOLR, function. This amounts to a standing bailout offer and encourages banks and non-bank financial institutions to engage in reckless lending or even speculation that both exacerbates the boom and bust cycle and can lead to financial crises such as those of 199,210 and 200,811 with ensuing bailouts. This function should be limited so that banks and other financial institutions behave more prudently, returning to their traditional role as conservative lenders rather than taking risks that are too large and lead to still another taxpayer bailout. Such a reform should be given plenty of lead time so that banks can self-correct lending practices without disrupting a financial system that has grown accustomed to such activities. Wind down the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Until the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve never held more than $1 trillion in assets, bought largely to influence monetary policy. Since then, these assets have exploded, and the Federal Reserve now owns nearly $9 trillion of mainly federal debt, $5.5 trillion, and mortgage-backed securities, $2.6 trillion. There is currently no government oversight of the types of assets that the Federal Reserve purchases. These purchases have two main effects: they encourage federal deficits and support politically favored markets, which include housing and even corporate debt. Over half of COVID-era deficits were monetized in this way by the Federal Reserve's purchase of treasuries, and housing costs were driven to historic highs by the Federal Reserve's purchase of mortgage securities. Together, this policy subsidizes government debt, starving business borrowing, while rewarding those who buy homes and certain corporations at the expense of the wider public. Federal Reserve balance sheet purchases should be limited by Congress, and the Federal Reserve's existing balance sheet should be wound down as quickly as is prudent to levels similar to what existed historically before the 2008 global financial crisis. Limit future balance sheet expansions to U.S. Treasuries. The Federal Reserve should be prohibited from picking winners and losers among asset classes. Above all, this means limiting Federal Reserve interventions in the mortgage-backed securities market. It also means eliminating Fed interventions in corporate and municipal debt markets. Restricting the Fed's open market operations to treasuries has strong economic support. The goal of monetary policy is to provide markets with needed liquidity without inducing resource misallocations caused by interfering with relative prices, including rates of return to securities. However, Fed intervention in longer-term government debt, mortgage-backed securities, and corporate and municipal debt can distort the pricing process. This more closely resembles credit allocation than liquidity provision. The Fed's mortgage-related activities are a paradigmatic case of what monetary policy should not do. Consider the effects of monetary policy on the housing market. Between February 2020 and August 2022, home prices increased 42%. Residential property prices in the United States adjusted for inflation are now 5.8% above the prior all-time record levels of 2006. The home price to median income ratio is now 7.68, far above the prior record high of 7.0 set in 2005. The mortgage payment to income ratio hit 43.3% in August 2022, breaking the highs of the prior housing bubble in 2008. Mortgage payment on a median-priced home, with a 20% down payment, jumped to $2,408 in the autumn of 2022 versus $1,404 just 1 year earlier as home prices continued to rise even as mortgage rates more than doubled. Renters have not been spared. Median apartment rental costs have jumped more than 24% since the start of 2021. Numerous cities experienced rent increases well in excess of 30%. A primary driver of higher costs during the past 3 years has been the Federal Reserve's purchases of mortgage-backed securities, MBS. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve has driven down mortgage interest rates and fueled a rise in housing costs by purchasing $1.3 trillion of MBSs from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae. The $2.7 trillion now owned by the Federal Reserve is nearly double the levels of March 2020. The flood of capital from the Federal Reserve into MBSs increased the amount of capital available for real estate purchases, while lower interest rates on mortgage borrowing, driven down in part by the Federal Reserve's MBS purchases, induced and enabled borrowers to take on even larger loans. The Federal Reserve should be precluded from any future purchases of MBSs and should wind down its holdings either by selling off the assets or by allowing them to mature without replacement. Stop paying interest on excess reserves. Under this policy, also started during the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve effectively prints money and then borrows it back from banks rather than those banks lending money to the public. This amounts to a transfer to Wall Street at the expense of the American public and has driven such excess reserves to $3.1 trillion, up 70-fold since 2007. The Federal Reserve should immediately end this practice and either sell off its balance sheet or simply stop paying interest so that banks instead lend the money. Congress should bring back the pre-2008 system, founded on open market operations. This minimizes the Fed's power to engage in preferential credit allocation. Monetary rule reform options. While the above recommendations would reduce Federal Reserve manipulation and subsidies, none would limit the inflationary and recessionary cycles caused by the Federal Reserve. For that, major reform of the Federal Reserve's core activity of manipulating interest rates and money would be needed. A core problem with government control of monetary policy is its exposure to two unavoidable political pressures: pressure to print money to subsidize government deficits and pressure to print money to boost the economy artificially until the next election. Because both will always exist with self-interested politicians, the only permanent remedy is to take the monetary steering wheel out of the Federal Reserve's hands and return it to the people. This could be done by abolishing the federal role in money altogether, allowing the use of commodity money, or embracing a strict monetary policy rule to ward off political meddling. Of course, neither free banking nor allowing commodity-backed money is currently being discussed, so we have formulated a menu of reforms. Each option involves trade-offs between how effectively it restrains the Federal Reserve and how difficult each policy would be to implement, both politically for Congress and economically in terms of disruption to existing financial institutions. We present these options in decreasing order of effectiveness against inflation and boom and bust recessionary cycles. Free banking. In free banking, neither interest rates nor the supply of money is controlled by the government. The Federal Reserve is effectively abolished, and the Department of the Treasury largely limits itself to handling the government's money. Regions of the U.S. actually had a similar system, known as the Suffolk system, from 1824 until the 1850s, and it minimized both inflation and economic disruption while allowing lending to flourish. Under free banking, banks typically issue liabilities, for example, checking accounts, denominated in dollars and backed by a valuable commodity. In the 19th century, this backing was commonly gold coins. Each dollar, for example, was defined as about 1/20th of an ounce of gold, redeemable on demand at the issuing bank. Today, we might expect most banks to back with gold, although some might prefer to back their notes with another currency or even buy equities or other assets such as real estate. Competition would determine the right mix of assets in banks' portfolios as backing for their liabilities. As in the Suffolk system, competition keeps banks from overprinting or lending irresponsibly. This is because any bank that issues more paper than it has assets available would be subject to competitor banks presenting its notes for redemption. In the extreme, an overissuing bank could be liable to a bank run. Reckless banks' competitors have good incentives to police risk closely lest their own holdings of competitor dollars become worthless. In this way, free banking leads to stable and sound currencies and strong financial systems because customers will avoid the riskier issuers, driving them out of the market. As a result of this stability and lack of inflation inherent in fully backed currencies, free banking could dramatically strengthen and increase both the dominant role of America's financial industry and the use of the US dollar as the global currency of choice. In fact, under free banking, the norm is for the dollar's purchasing power to rise gently over time, reflecting gains in economic productivity. This supply-side deflation does not cause economic busts. In fact, by ensuring that cash earns a positive, inflation-adjusted, rate of return, it can prevent households and businesses from holding inefficiently small money balances. Further benefits of free banking include dramatic reduction of economic cycles, an end to indirect financing of federal spending, removal of the lender of last resort permanent bailout function of central banks, and promotion of currency competition. This allows Americans many more ways to protect their savings. Because free banking implies that financial services and banking would be governed by general business laws against, for example, fraud or misrepresentation, crony regulatory burdens that hurt customers would be dramatically eased, and innovation would be encouraged. Potential downsides of free banking stem from its greatest benefit: it has massive political hurdles to clear. Economic theory predicts and economic history confirms that free banking is both stable and productive, but it is radically different from the system we have now. Transitioning to free banking would require political authorities, including Congress and the President, to coordinate on multiple reforms simultaneously. Getting any of them wrong could imbalance an otherwise functional system. Ironically, it is the very strength of a true free banking system that makes transitioning to one so difficult. Commodity-backed money. For most of U.S. history, the dollar was defined in terms of both gold and silver. The problem was that when the legal price differed from the market price, the artificially undervalued currency would disappear from circulation. There were times, for instance, when this mechanism put the U.S. on a de facto silver standard. However, As a result, inflation was limited. Given this track record, restoring a gold standard retains some appeal among monetary reformers who do not wish to go so far as abolishing the Federal Reserve. Both the 2012 and 2016 GOP platforms urged the establishment of a commission to consider the feasibility of a return to the gold standard, and in October 2022, Representative Alexander Mooney, R.W.V., introduced a bill to restore the gold standard. In economic effect, commodity backing the dollar differs from free banking in that the government, via the Fed, maintains both regulatory and bailout functions. However, manipulation of money and credit is limited because new dollars are not costless to the federal government, they must be backed by some hard asset like gold. Compared to free banking, then, the benefits of commodity-backed money are reduced, but transition disruptions are also smaller. The process of commodity backing is very straightforward. Treasury could set the price of $1 at today's market price of $2,000 per ounce of gold. This means that each Federal Reserve note could be redeemed at the Federal Reserve and exchanged for January 2000 ounce of gold about $80, for example, for a gold coin the weight of a dime. Private bank liabilities would be redeemable upon their issuers. Banks could send those traded in dollars to the Treasury for gold to replenish their vaults. This creates a powerful self-policing mechanism. If the federal government creates dollars too quickly, more people will doubt the peg and turn in their gold to banks, which then will turn in their gold and drain the government's gold. This forces governments to rein in spending and inflation lest their gold reserves become depleted. One concern raised against commodity backing is that there is not enough gold in the federal government for all the dollars in existence. This is solved by making sure that the initial peg on gold is correct. Also, in reality, a very small number of users trade for gold as long as they believe the government will stick to the price peg. The mere fact that people could exchange dollars for gold is what acts as the enforcer. After all, if one is confident that $1 will still be worth January 2000 ounce of gold in a year, it is much easier to walk about with paper dollars and use credit cards than it is to mail tiny $80 coins. People would redeem en masse only if they feared the government would not be able to control itself, for which the only solution is for the government to control itself. Beyond full backing, alternate paths to gold backing might involve gold convertible treasury instruments or allowing a parallel gold standard to operate temporarily alongside the current fiat dollar. These could ease adoption while minimizing disruption, but they should be temporary so that we can quickly enjoy the benefits of gold's ability to police government spending. In addition, Congress could simply allow individuals to use commodity-backed money without fully replacing the current system. Among downsides to a commodity standard, there is no guarantee that the government will stick to the price peg. Also, allowing a commodity standard to operate along with a fiat dollar opens both up for a speculative attack. Another downside is that even under a commodity standard, the Federal Reserve can still influence the economy via interest rate or other interventions. Therefore, at best, a commodity standard is not a full solution to returning to free banking. We have good reasons to worry that central banks and the gold standard are fundamentally incompatible, as the disastrous experience of the Western nations on their managed gold standards between World War I and World War II showed. K% rule. Under this rule, proposed by Milton Friedman in 1960, the Federal Reserve would create money at a fixed rate, say 3% per year. By offering the inflation benefits of gold without the potential disruption to the financial system, a K% rule could be a more politically viable alternative to gold. The principal flaw is that unlike commodities, a K% rule is not fixed by physical costs, it could change according to political pressures or random economic fluctuations. Importantly, financial innovation could destabilize the market's demand for liquidity, as happened with changes in consumer credit patterns in the 1970s. When this happens, a given K% rule that previously delivered stability could become destabilizing. In addition, monetary policy when Friedman proposed the K% rule was very different from monetary policy today. Adopting a K% rule would require considering what transitions need to take place. Inflation targeting rules. Inflation targeting is the current de facto Federal Reserve rule. Under inflation targeting, the Federal Reserve chooses a target inflation rate, essentially the highest it thinks the public will accept, and then tries to engineer the money supply to achieve that goal. Chairman Jerome Powell and others before him have used 2% as their target inflation rate, although some are now floating 3% or 4%. The result can be boom and bust cycles of inflation and recession driven by disruptive policy manipulations, both because the Federal Reserve is liable to political pressure and because making economic predictions is very difficult if not impossible. Inflation and growth targeting rules. Inflation and growth targeting is a popular proposal for reforming the Federal Reserve. Two of the most prominent versions of inflation and growth targeting are a Taylor rule and nominal GDP, NGDP, targeting. Both offer similar costs and benefits. Economists generally believe that the economy's long-term real growth trend is determined by non-monetary factors. The Fed's job is to minimize fluctuations around that trend nominal growth rate. Speculative booms and destructive busts caused by swings in total spending should be avoided. NGDP targeting stabilizes total nominal spending directly. The Taylor rule does so indirectly, operating through the federal funds rate. NGDP targeting keeps total nominal spending growth on a steady path. If the demand for money, liquidity, rises, the Fed meets it by increasing the money supply. If the demand for money falls, the Fed responds by reducing the money supply. This minimizes the effects of demand shocks on the economy. For example, if the long-run growth rate of the U.S. economy is 3% and the Fed has a 5% NGDP growth target, it expands the money supply enough to boost nominal income by 5% each year, which translates into 3% real growth and 2% inflation. How much money must be created each year depends on how fast money demand is growing. The Taylor rule works similarly. It says the Fed should raise its policy rate when inflation and real output growth are above trend and lower its policy rate when inflation and real output growth are below trend. Whereas NGDP targeting focuses directly on stable demand as an outcome, the Taylor rule focuses on the Fed's more reliable policy levers. The problem with both rules is the knowledge burden they place on central bankers. These rules state that the Fed should neutralize demand shocks but not respond to supply shocks, which means that it should see through demand shocks by tolerating higher, or lower, inflation. In theory, this has much to recommend it. In practice, it can be very difficult to distinguish between demand-side destabilization and supply-side destabilization in real time. There also are political considerations. Fed officials may not be willing to curb unjustified economic booms and all too willing to suppress necessary economic restructuring following a bust. Either rule likely outperforms a strict inflation target and greatly outperforms the Fed's current pseudo-inflation target. While NGDP targeting and the Taylor rule have much to commend them, they might be harder to explain and justify to the public. Inflation targeting has an intelligibility advantage. Voters know what it means to stabilize the dollar's purchasing power. Capable elected officials must persuade the public that the advantages of NGDP targeting and the Taylor rule, especially in terms of supporting labor markets, outweigh the disadvantages. Minimum effective reforms. Because Washington operates on two-year election cycles, any monetary reform must take account of disruption to financial markets and the economy at large. Free banking and commodity-backed money offer economic benefits by limiting government manipulation, inflation, and recessionary cycles while dramatically reducing federal deficits, but given potential disruption to the financial system, a K% rule may be a more feasible option. The other rules discussed, inflation targeting, NGDP targeting, and the Taylor rule, are more complicated but also more flexible. While their economic benefits are significant, public opinion expressed through the lawmaking process in the Constitution should ultimately determine the monetary institutional order in a free society. The minimum of effective reforms includes the following: eliminate full employment from the Fed's mandate, requiring it to focus on price stability alone. Have elected officials compel the Fed to specify its target range for inflation and inform the public of a concrete intended growth path. There should be no more flexible average inflation targeting, which amounts to ex post justification for bad policy. Focus any regulatory activities on maintaining bank capital adequacy. Elected officials must clamp down on the Fed's incorporation of environmental, social, and governance factors into its mandate, including by amending its financial stability mandate. Curb the Fed's excessive last resort lending practices. These practices are directly responsible for too big to fail and the institutionalization of moral hazard in our financial system. Appoint a commission to explore the mission of the Federal Reserve, alternatives to the Federal Reserve System, and the nation's financial regulatory apparatus. Prevent the institution of a central bank digital currency, CBDC. A CBDC would provide unprecedented surveillance and potential control of financial transactions without providing added benefits available through existing technologies. Chapter 25, page 745. Small Business Administration. Mission Statement. The U.S. Small Business Administration, SBA, supports U.S. entrepreneurship and small business growth by strengthening free enterprise through policy advocacy and facilitating programs that help entrepreneurs to launch and grow their businesses and compete effectively in the global marketplace. Overview. Created almost 70 years ago, the SBA was launched under the Small Business Act with a mission to aid, counsel, assist and protect, insofar as is possible, the interests of small business concerns. According to its current mission statement, the U.S. Small Business Administration, SBA, helps Americans start, grow, and build resilient businesses. SBA was created in 1953 as an independent agency of the federal government to aid, counsel, assist and protect the interests of small business concerns, preserve free competitive enterprise, and maintain and strengthen the overall economy of our nation. The SBA's founding mission has evolved over time as programs have been expanded or implemented, subject to the philosophical grounding of each administration as well as assorted economic challenges and the occurrence of natural disasters. Because of its distinct role in the federal government, the SBA became the default agency for providing disaster loans to small businesses, homeowners, renters, and organizations. As a result, hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars have been funneled through the agency to businesses and individuals over the years. Some SBA programs are effective, others are not. The largest program in SBA's history, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, has been credited with saving millions of jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic. A conservative administration would rightly focus on saving small businesses during such a crisis. At the same time, however, various SBA programs have generated waste, fraud, and mismanagement of taxpayer dollars. For example, and more recently, more than $1 trillion in COVID-19 relief was distributed through the SBA. The SBA's EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan, Advance program in particular shows the dangers that can come with direct government lending. EIDL Advance provided direct cash grants and loans to small businesses. The SBA Office of Inspector General identified $78.1 billion in potentially fraudulent EIDL loans and grants paid to ineligible entities, which represented more than half of all funds spent through the program. Although PPP worked through private lenders and as a result experienced relatively less fraud than EIDL experienced, it is estimated that at least 70,000 PPP loans were potentially fraudulent. Origin, history, and core functions. In 1954, the agency began to execute such core functions as making and guaranteeing loans for small businesses, ensuring that small businesses earn a fair proportion of government contracts and sales of surplus property, and providing business owners with management and business training. In 1970, President Richard Nixon's Executive Order 11518 enhanced the agency's advocacy role by providing for the increased representation of the interests of small business concerns before departments and agencies of the United States government. This advocacy role was strengthened with the adoption of the Small Business Amendments of 1974, which established the Chief Counsel for Advocacy, and was then reinforced and expanded in 1976 with the creation of the Office of Advocacy, providing additional resources to ensure that small businesses had a voice in the regulatory process. In 1980, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, RFA, further strengthened the Office of Advocacy's role, providing accountability across federal agencies to ensure that they considered the impact of their rulemakings on small businesses. The RFA requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their regulations on small businesses and other small entities, and the Office of Advocacy is charged with ensuring that federal agencies abide by the law and is required to provide an annual report to the President and the Senate and House committees on small business. In addition, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, TFTA, of 201613 established a new role for the Office of Advocacy, to facilitate greater consideration of small business economic issues during international trade negotiations. This small office has been relatively effective over the years and more productive during periods when a strong Chief Counsel for Advocacy has been installed to utilize the Office of Advocacy's authority aggressively to provide a check on regulatory overreach. The office is one of the bright spots within the SBA that a conservative administration could supercharge to dismantle extreme regulatory policies and advance limited government reforms that promote economic freedom and opportunity. Currently, the SBA's 4 core functions include: access to capital. SBA maintains assorted financing and lending programs for small businesses, from micro-lending to debt and equity investment capital. Entrepreneurial development programs. SBA provides free or low-cost training at more than 1,800 locations and through online platforms and webinars. Government contracting support programs. Through goals established by the SBA for federal departments and agencies, the broader goal is to ensure that small businesses win 23% of prime contracts. Advocacy. This independent office within the SBA works to ensure that federal agencies consider small businesses' concerns and impact in rulemakings. The office also conducts small business research. Budgetary fluctuation. SBA's budget and programs have expanded significantly under some administrations and have been scaled back under others. President Ronald Reagan cut the SBA's budget by more than 30%, and his annual budgets regularly proposed to eliminate the agency altogether. Under President George W. Bush, SBA Administrator Hector Barreto said that SBA's goal was to do more with less, but this changed because of Hurricane Katrina and a surge in disaster funding. In 2016, President Barack Obama considered streamlining and combining SBA programs and other business-related agencies and programs under one entity at the U.S. Department of Commerce, but opposition within the small business lobby in Washington scuttled the effort. In general, SBA budget fluctuations have been driven by several factors such as efforts by administrations either to cut or to greatly expand programs, the need to boost disaster assistance because of economic or weather-related events, business loan credit subsidy costs, and miscellaneous program enhancements to support small businesses through economic challenges or circumstances. As noted by the Congressional Research Service, overall, the SBA's appropriations have ranged from a high of over $761 billion in FY 2020 to a low of $571.8 million in FY 2007. Much of this volatility is due to significant variation in supplemental appropriations for disaster assistance to address economic damages caused by major hurricanes and for SBA lending program enhancements to help small businesses access capital during and immediately following recessions. For example, In FY 2020, the SBA received over $760.9 billion in supplemental appropriations to assist small businesses adversely affected by the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic. The CRS further notes that overall, since FY 2000, appropriations for SBA's other programs, excluding supplemental appropriations, have increased at a pace that exceeds inflation. In terms of current loan volume, the SBA reached nearly $43 billion in funding to small businesses, providing more than 62,000 traditional loans through its 7(a), 504, and microloan lending partners and over 1,200 investments through SBA-licensed small business investment companies, SBICs, for fiscal year FY 2022. The agency's total budgetary resources for FY 2022 amount to $44 billion, which represents 0.4% of the FY 2022 U.S. federal budget. History of mismanagement. Throughout its history, various SBA programs and practices have generated negative news headlines and scathing Government Accountability Office, GAO, and Inspector General, IG, reports that have centered on mismanagement, lack of competent personnel and/or systems, and waste, fraud, and abuse. From the AIDA program to Hurricane Katrina to the more current COVID-19, EIDL, program and PPP lending program, the SBA has managed to maintain its lending role even when repeated system failures have affected its distribution of funds. Congress has been somewhat responsive, pressuring the SBA to clean up fraud-related matters within its COVID-19 lending and grant programs. Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives have gone farther, specifying that the SBA needs to improve transparency and accountability and deal with mission creep, the expansion of unauthorized programs, and structural and reporting deficiencies that have allowed mismanagement and fraud to reoccur, largely through massive supplemental appropriations. The SBA is led by an administrator, currently a member of the President's Cabinet, and a deputy administrator. Senate-confirmed appointees include the Administrator, Deputy Administrator, Chief Counsel for Advocacy, and Inspector General. Entrepreneurs and small businesses require limited government policies that do not impede their risk-taking and growth. A future administration can leverage and strengthen core SBA functions that have been fairly effective at reining in and calling attention to costly regulations and policies that are harmful to small businesses. This core advocacy function is aided both by statutory authority and by a network of small business organizations and allies that support limited government policies. Moreover, an effective SBA administrator and leadership team can work and advocate across the federal government to ensure that extreme regulatory policies or anti-competitive rules and actions that may favor big businesses over small businesses or international competitors over American small businesses are dismantled or do not progress when proposed. Mission creep and enlargement. As noted, Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives have evidenced concern about SBA mission creep and the need to make a sprawling, unaccountable agency more focused and operationally sound. Moreover, there is unease that the agency has moved from being open to any eligible small business searching for support to being hyper-focused on disproportionately impacted, politically favored, or geographically situated small businesses and entrepreneurs. Today, initiatives aimed at inclusivity are in fact creating exclusivity and stringent selectivity in deciding what types of small businesses and entities can use SBA programs. For example, even though the SBA under President Donald Trump proposed a rule to remove all of the unconstitutional religious exclusions from its regulations to conform with Supreme Court decisions that have made their unconstitutionality clear, the SBA has not acted on the proposed rule and still uses religious exclusions in determining eligibility for business loans. Several other specific concerns include but are not limited to, the SBA's request to become a designated voter agency in response to President Biden's executive order on promoting access to voting. The creation of duplicative channels and pilot programs for the delivery of business training rather than working through existing counseling partners. The programs are largely duplicative of private, state and local government, and educational system offerings. A push to expand direct government lending. The SBA in a conservative administration. Reforming and restructuring the SBA under a conservative administration would meet the needs of America's small business owners and entrepreneurs, not special interests in Washington, D.C. Entrepreneurs believe the SBA is fairly archaic in its operations and programming and must be transformed to serve small businesses in the modern economy effectively. Therefore, a restructured and reformed SBA would end the long-term deficiencies, practices, and problems that have prolonged the decades-long cycle of waste, fraud, and mismanagement. Moreover, the SBA administrator and leadership can provide significant value to all small businesses by strongly advocating for their policy needs and fostering an agency-wide culture that values all small business owners and does not exclude certain groups. Under a conservative administration, success would yield a highly qualified SBA administrator and leadership team that can competently run the agency and enthusiastically advocate for the policy issues and needs of small business owners and entrepreneurs. A tighter, more focused SBA that concentrates on congressionally authorized programs. An accountable SBA administrator and staff who report regularly to Congress, respond on a timely basis to requests from individual members of Congress, and satisfactorily implement or respond to IG and GAO recommendations. A full accounting of and an end to waste, fraud, and abuse in all COVID-19 relief programs, including the PPP and EIDL programs, and action that follows the rule of law by ensuring that loan recipients who are not eligible for loan forgiveness or who falsified loan applications either pay back the funds or are referred to law enforcement. An end to SBA direct lending. An approach to small business lending and capital programs that supports a resilient small business supply chain, for example, by financing technological upgrades and capital expenditures. Outreach to all small businesses and those that are eligible for program support across sectors and geographic areas. Through congressionally authorized programs and collaboration with partners and business associations, the SBA could use the latest technology and platforms to implement relevant initiatives to reach small businesses. Programs would be non-duplicative and implemented on a first-come, first-served basis. A modern, revamped, and streamlined SBA that better utilizes current technology and platforms for operations, for reporting, and in its programs to reach, service, and engage small businesses. An Office of Advocacy that is strengthened by a renewed mandate and additional resources to protect against overregulation, along with a research agenda that includes measuring the total cost that federal regulation imposes on small businesses. Accountability and managerial practice. The SBA lacks accountability and managerial practices to measure the effectiveness, success, and integrity of its various programs. As a future administration evaluates agency structure and the particulars of how the SBA is spending appropriated funds, it should immediately require actions and procedures to compel a culture of accountability and performance. Specifically, require performance metrics and internal procedures to safeguard taxpayer dollars and program integrity. As noted in an October 2022 IG report, failure to adopt procedures that would reliably capture data and information for various programs, coupled with significant challenges and weaknesses regarding IT investments, systems development, and security controls, presents significant risks to program integrity and increased risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. Addressing these shortcomings and risks should be a priority challenge and action item for the next administration. As underscored by the Inspector General in his introduction to the report, pandemic response has, in many instances, magnified the challenging systemic issues in SBA's mission-related work. Review all internal government watchdog recommendations and require that SBA management implement or address outstanding and ongoing OIG and GAO recommendations within a specified time frame, ideally within 90 days of a recommendation, and on an ongoing basis. Strengthening the Office of Advocacy. The SBA Office of Advocacy, is an independent office within the SBA. It accounts for about 1/1000th of SBA spending and 0% of SBA personnel. Under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, both under its current authority and with suggested reforms, the Office of Advocacy could be a powerful weapon against the administrative state's regulatory extremism. Amend the RFA so that all agencies are required to provide a copy of any proposed rule, other than bona fide emergency rules, along with initial regulatory flexibility analysis to the Office of Advocacy at least 60 days before a notice of proposed rulemaking is submitted for publication in the Federal Register. The Office of Advocacy would submit comments to agencies within 30 days, and each agency would have to consider these comments, make changes in the proposed rule based on those comments, or explain in a revised regulatory flexibility analysis why it chose not to change the proposed rule. The Office of Advocacy's pre-proposing comments would be published on the agency's and its own websites. RFA economic analysis should be expanded to include indirect costs along with direct costs. In addition, the next administration should require other agencies to seek advocacy's input. Currently, other agencies deny advocacy the ability to enforce their duty to consider the effect of regulations on small entities by construing their regulations as not having significant economic impact, which would otherwise serve as a trigger for advocacy's input. Congress should presumptively exempt small businesses from new agency rules to force agencies to seek advocacy's input and permit new rules to apply to small businesses only with advocacy sign-off under specified criteria. Increase the Office of Advocacy's budget by at least 50%, $4 million. This would allow advocacy to hire approximately 25 attorneys, economists, and scientists and enhance its role in the regulatory process. Explicitly direct federal agencies to comply with the RFA. This would be similar to the approach adopted by President Trump in his January and February 2017 executive orders directing agencies to relieve the cost and burden of regulation on business. Advocacy should organize regional roundtables, on-site small business visits, and an online platform to hear directly from small businesses and entities as it did from June 2017 through September 2018. This activity produced 26 letters to federal agencies and highlighted specific regulations that need reform and how Congress had addressed the most burdensome rules through the Congressional Review Act. COVID-19 lending program accountability and cleanup. A major immediate priority for the next administration should be a final accounting and accelerated cleanup of fraudulent COVID-19 loan and grant activity. As noted by the SBA IG, Managing COVID-19 stimulus lending is the greatest overall challenge facing SBA, and it may likely continue to be for many years as the agency grapples with fraud in the programs. The next administration should consider bringing in private sector support and expertise to close out these programs. Forgiveness and fraud must be dealt with as swiftly as possible, and law enforcement officials must pursue fraud vigorously. Entities receiving PPP loans that did not meet eligibility for forgiveness must be required to pay back the money. For example, under the CARES Act, PPP loan applicants generally were eligible only if, together with all their affiliates, they had no more than 500 employees. Numerous Planned Parenthood affiliates self-certified eligibility for PPP loans during the initial wave of loans that were governed by the CARES Act size requirement. Many senators and representatives asserted that these Planned Parenthood organizations were ineligible because considered together with their affiliates they exceeded the maximum eligible size. The Trump administration SBA notified several Planned Parenthood PPP recipients of its preliminary determination of their ineligibility and of SBA's authority to take various actions against applicants that falsely certified their eligibility. To date, despite continued oversight attempts by members of Congress, the SBA has taken no action on the Planned Parenthood loans other than to forgive them, and in 2021, it approved new PPP loans to Planned Parenthood affiliates. Cooperate with ongoing congressional oversight efforts and determine whether SBA has authority to reverse the forgiveness decisions. If it does have that authority, the SBA should reverse the forgiveness decisions for the subject loans, reiterate its preliminary determinations of ineligibility, investigate the matter more thoroughly, and take all appropriate action when its investigation concludes. Regardless of whether it reverses its forgiveness, if its investigation uncovers evidence that Planned Parenthood affiliates or any other loan recipients knowingly misrepresented their eligibility in their applications, the SBA should make appropriate referrals to the Department of Justice. Disaster Loan Program and Direct Lending. The SBA's Disaster Loan Program provides low-interest loans to personal, business, and nonprofit borrowers following a federally declared disaster. The program suffers from problems of coordination with Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, disaster assistance. For example, disaster relief applicants have an incentive to avoid being approved for SBA disaster loans in order to increase the amount of FEMA assistance for which they are eligible. Moreover, the availability of disaster loans reduces individuals' incentives to purchase disaster-related insurance. More than 90% of SBA disaster loans are loans to individuals such as homeowners, not to small businesses. In view of the challenges the SBA has experienced in its administration of this program, as well as the fraud and abuse in the EIDL COVID-19 related program and the IG's concern that the systemic problems within this lending program undermine the SBA's work, the next administration should work with Congress to assess the extent to which disaster loans should be offered by another agency rather than the SBA and explore private sector channels for administering the loans. Specify clearly that no new direct lending programs will be developed at the SBA. Eligibility of religious entities for SBA loans. Current SBA regulations and SBA Form 197,147 make certain religious entities ineligible to participate in several SBA loan programs. The Trump administration proposed a rule that would remove the provisions on the ground that they violate the First Amendment. Subsequent Supreme Court decisions have made their unconstitutionality clearer. In an April 3, 2020, letter to Congress pursuant to 28 U.S. Code 530D, the Trump administration SBA advised that two such provisions violate the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment and that it therefore would not enforce them. On January 19, 2021, the Trump administration SBA proposed a rule to remove all of the unconstitutional religious exclusions from its regulations. The SBA has not acted on the proposed rule. A similar religious exclusion once appeared in the regulation governing eligibility for SBA business loan programs, but it was removed in a June 2022 final rule that noted tension with the First Amendment and Supreme Court precedent. That final rule announced that the SBA would nonetheless continue to make religious eligibility determinations for business loan applicants to comply with putative Establishment Clause requirements, but Supreme Court precedent and Office of Legal Counsel memoranda refute the notion that large government-backed loan programs raise any Establishment Clause concerns. The SBA uses the same religious eligibility worksheet, SBA Form 1971, to make eligibility determinations for all affected programs, including the business loan programs. Thus, the SBA continues to act as though the unconstitutional regulation were still in place, and there is no Establishment Clause basis for doing so. The next administration should immediately notify Congress under 28 U.S. Code 530D that it will not enforce these unconstitutional regulations. Take down SBA Form 1971. Finalize the Trump administration's proposed rule or publish its own updated proposed rule to remove the unconstitutional regulations. Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Programs. The SBA coordinates and monitors the Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR, and Small Business Technology Transfer, STTR, programs for all federal agencies with extramural budgets for research or research and development, R/R&D, in excess of the expenditures established in Sections 9, F, and 9, N, of the Small Business Act. The SBIR and STTR Extension Act of 2022 extended these programs from September 30, 2022, through September 30, 2025. SBIR requires that 3.2% of spending by agencies with extramural R&D budgets of $100 million or more must be directed to small businesses. STTR allocates 0% of federal research spending to small firms. Research has shown that this small portion of federal R&D spending is disproportionately effective. The SBIR program has consistently demonstrated its ability to fund advanced technologies through to private market viability and invests more in America's heartland than venture capital invests. SBIR and STTR have overcome the tendency of federal contracting officers to deal only with large firms that are familiar to them and have the expertise and lobbying clout to navigate the federal procurement process. The next administration should continue the SBIR and SBTT programs as they successfully fund the next wave of technological innovation to compete with big tech, urge Congress to expand the amount that other agencies are required to set aside from their general R&D budgets for the SBIR program. Ensure the enactment of stricter rules requiring that SBIR funds must be expended on capital investments in the United States. Domestic manufacturing and small business. Small businesses in the manufacturing sector face shortfalls in access to capital. As manufacturing employment, domestic business investment, and non-information technology output have declined, expectations for market returns and the capital available to small manufacturing enterprises have diminished. This is especially true for capital-intensive sectors like transportation and energy that require large upfront investments and relatively lower margin sectors like plastics, textiles, furniture, and agriculture. Yet these industries and others like them traditionally have been the backbone of American manufacturing employment. They also are sources of self-sufficiency and resilience at a time when global supply chains are increasingly uncertain. The public policy problems that are caused by declining small manufacturing are especially acute when it comes to the production of advanced technologies. Other agencies and programs invest immense taxpayer resources in basic science and research. Over time, that research results in some breakthrough technologies, but when it is time to put these breakthroughs into practice by manufacturing goods and services, much of the necessary productive capacity is offshore. For many technologies, the American economy lacks the capacity to scale up innovations that might not be immediately profitable. Instead, those technologies are put into practice abroad. In this way, foreign companies and foreign productive sites buy and implement taxpayer-funded American technologies. The SBA's existing programs should be reformed to expand the private market for capital in small manufacturer expansion. The next administration should ask Congress to make available a category of Section 7(a) loans with a larger available principal that is used to finance manufacturing facility construction and equipment upgrading. The proposed SBA Reauthorization and Improvement Act of 2019, for example, would have increased the maximum loan principal to $50 million for advanced manufacturing construction and upgrading. The Section 7(a) loan program operates through private lenders and guarantees a portion of private sector loans made to qualifying small businesses. The maximum principal available is $5 million, but small businesses in capital-intensive sectors require significantly larger amounts of capital to finance upfront capital costs. Reform the Small Business Investment Company, SBIC, program to refocus its support on small businesses rather than technology startups only. The SBIC program operates through private venture capital and private equity funds by providing eligible funds with guaranteed debt financing to support investments in small businesses. However, the program largely duplicates private sector venture capital to the extent that the sector receiving much of its support is software and information technology, which already receive the lion's share of venture capital investment. In addition, Congress should reform the SBIC program to make its financing more favorable to capital-intense investments and small manufacturers. The Health, Economic Assistance, Liability Protection, and Schools, HEALS, Act, introduced in 2020, and American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, introduced in 2021, would allow SBIC to offer longer-term financing to manufacturers and make the program more fiscally sustainable. Small Business Size Standard Modernization. Many small business programs both inside and outside the SBA use the SBA's definition of small business. Under the Small Business Act, the SBA is tasked with defining what counts as a small business and ensuring that the definition varies from industry to reflect differences in regular size by industry. However, the SBA's small business size standards reflect a one-size-fits-all approach under which all businesses within its size standard are considered small businesses for all eligible purposes, from government contracting preferences to eligibility for SBA loans through private banks. At the same time, the SBA is an outlier among competing economies in not considering medium-sized enterprises along with small businesses, often referred to collectively as small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Medium-sized and regional businesses are increasingly critical to maintaining competition. The next administration should encourage Congress to create a medium-sized business classification with its eligibility for programs confined to access to capital programs from projects for which credit elsewhere does not exist. End hour 23, page 757.